Welcome back, friends, fellow philosophers, and authors to this Wild Isle podcast. I have with me a wonderful crew of authors, and we will go through them one at a time. I am MarQuese Little. You should know who I am, author and editor at Wild Isle Literature. I've got two books out. The Tears of Winter is the new one. Viking folkloric fantasy little novella, easy to pick up. Also, Lawn Smoke Broken, available on my website on audio for free. Weird fantasy fiction, kind of gas lamp, interconnected world with The Tears of Winter, which will be the first of many. If you're an author and you're looking for an editor, I specialize in line editing and developmental editing for theme in particular. So those are needs of yours or wants of yours. Check me out. I'm also a ghostwriter. So if you want me to write for you because maybe you have these great ideas, you just don't have the time in order to implement them, well, there you go. I can help you out. So let's go around the table. Let's just take a few sentences to tell people who you are, what kind of stuff you write, and where they can find you. We'll go Matt, Amaya, and then RJ.
Hey, Matt Dawson here. Um, Game dev, artist, and author extraordinaire. Um, I am about to publish a six-book series, soon to be
Ooh,
out on Amazon later this fall. So
That's
keep an eye
awesome.
out for that. And you can
congratulations.
find.
That's a lot of work.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a bit of a trek. But you could catch some of that and more news about the games and some of the other projects I'm working on top of the books at machinedarts.com.
Thank you, Matthew. Amaya, who are you, and what have you published, and where can we find you?
Well, my name is Amaya Tenshi. I am currently published through Penmore Press. I have 3 books out in the series. There's probably going to be at least 6 or 8 for this installment of it. It's called the Dracula series. You can find it on Amazon. I think you can actually still order the paperback through Barnes and Noble if you like. Nook, like Goodreads, like a lot of places where those are available. First book is called Dracula's Guest, then it goes Dracula's Match, then Dracula's Death is the most recent one. It just dropped like a week ago. I also have a website, amayatenshi.com. I don't update it very often, but it has some of my short stories. So most of my short stories are gone. I suffered a data loss, but as I get more, I'll try to post them there.
Oh man, I'm
So
sorry to hear that.
it's what it is. So also, I will say for Marquez, as an editor, he does a good job. I can say this because I hired him to do some editing.
Hmm.
Definitely hire MarQuese for
Yes.
editing.
There's a
Yeah, I work with
bias in
him
this
too, and
room
it's
about
great.
that.
No,
I,
we're
I learned
completely
a lot.
unbiased. There's definitely no slants here. Can just hire
I
him.
learned.
It'll be
I
great.
learned a lot under Marquise, so it was a great experience.
I'm so glad that everyone had a great experience. So if you too would like a great experience and to learn what I learned at grad school without having to go $100,000 in debt, go over to
Yeah,
Wild Isle
please don't.
Literature. RJ, go ahead, tell people, who you are, what kind of stuff you write, and
Uh,
where they can find you.
um, well, my name is RJ, or Robert Guerin is my carrying title. My little nom de plume, and basically, like, I write right now short stories, mostly like dealing with science fiction, the weird fantasy, and basically, I'm also, you can find me on Twitter at I guess you could say, let me, this is all brand new to me, so a lot of times my name would not like, a lot of times the handles escape me, so it's say let's see here. Uh, it's Robert J. Garin. Let me see. I'm also on Phantom Whispers site. I'm also helping like set that site up as well. Um, that's uh, let's see. Yeah, it's at Robert J. Garin on Twitter X, and I also have a Minds and a Substack as well. Just I think for Substack it's just under Robert Garin. Um, uh, Same thing with Minds, but also I'm under like my artist name, Scribbles and Bits on Minds. So it's and yeah, man, if anybody needs illustrations or like or cartoons, I'd be game. But yeah, but in terms of my writing though, I'm budding, so I'm brand new, and I've yet to. I'm soon to probably like. I'm actually editing some older stories of mine, and I'll eventually be putting those up, and some I look to hopefully submit to various publications. However, at the moment, I do have 4 pieces that are in Phantom Whispers. That's spearheaded by Ian Knoll. Um, was kind enough to include me and even a few of my illustrations. That the first issue will be released in June, and it's but that's it's something that I'm looking to like just try to find ways of distributing to as many outlets as possible. But um, but it's a time of learning now, so it's just a time it's just a time just to like throw yourself in and just completely relearn things in life that you were never accustomed to before. So it's a pretty daunting task because right now, like I'm unemployed in my career of animation, and it's been like this for a year, and like
Oof.
there's
Mm.
nothing out there. There is
There's all the
nothing out
more
there.
it's
Oh,
all the more
sorry.
reason to go and hire you. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, commissions for RJ over
Hey, maybe
so
Minea.
yeah.
Minea's been looking for someone to animate some of his stuff. I
There you
don't know.
go.
So
Who's Manea?
Oh, if you're not on Minds, I can DM you afterwards. But he's trying to
Absolutely.
get it. Yeah, he's trying to get a comic book series out. I was working with him, but I'm very slow at art. Is the problem? So he doesn't have anything to show for it, and that's my fault. So
Yeah.
all right. Well,
Cool.
so but you mentioned a time of learning, RJ, and I think aside from me sending people to go hire you for commissions for cartoon work, which you should definitely do, um,
yes.
we're gonna be doing quite a lot of learning today. So I forgot to tell everyone the episode name. Today is the Pantser's Guide to Planning. So what that means is, well, what is a pantser? Now, my understanding of the word pantser is you write off the seat of your pants. You make the story as you go. You don't do very heavy, at least planning beforehand. The world building is emergent as opposed to what would be the word, like operationalized. Maybe might be taking something from scientific research. It's not that's not important. What is important is that we have here today the author of Dracula's Death. I don't know if I mentioned that it's at the time of release of this podcast, a new novel. It's the newest in the series, and we are very thankful to have her here as our representative planner because I know that she does excellent and very thorough research. Whenever I've listened to too many British people, when when she researches her novels and plots out. I mean, you have to plot out when you have what you said, like 6 to 8 installments. You have to be thinking
In
ahead.
this version of the series before it jumps to the historical fiction part.
So there's more, right? So the
Yeah.
point
Oh
is
yeah.
that
No, this
you
historical fiction part might be huge. I don't know.
so what we're going to do today is we're going to have a bit of a seminar. And hey, you listeners, yes, you fellow philosophers and authors, you can as well. Feel free to take notes with us, post questions in the comments, wherever you happen to see this. And, Amaya's super busy, so I don't know if she'll get around, but we'll all try to answer as best we can. So you guys can participate as well. It won't just be us here in the depths of hell. I keep saying that because I can never get these all the flies out of my apartment. All right. So without further ado, Amaya, I guess I'll start this off by framing this with a question, so you're not just thrown out into the wilderness. So when we say planning, right? Because we can kind of understand, pantsing or organic writing. I'm not doing that. I am, quote unquote, just writing. We'll have a whole podcast on the difference behind that, and then Matt can reveal his master thesis. But when I say the word planning in regard to writing fiction, what the hell does that mean to you? What does planning mean?
I would say usually is you have let's say a set goal in mind. Uh, Now, if we want to focus specifically on the craft of writing, we're not going to discuss like I want it to be published or anything like that. More like you have your idea, presumably, because I don't. I think it'd be super pantser to just sit down and just see what happens. I think most people have at least an idea of a story. It's going to be like something like there's going to be a main character boy and he meets a girl and then they go on an adventure and at the end they get married. Something like that, right? The like barest bones at least of a concept. So if you wanted to plan that, like this is at least how I've approached it. And I learned this method actually from a script writer who used to write for TV in the 90s. I can't remember his name actually. I feel terrible because I haven't read his book in a while. but he used to write for episodes of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles back in the 90s, or no, actually, I think the late 80s. The thing is, if you're writing for TV, of course, you have to turn out, your 40-page script, because that's what it was back in the, or 20 pages, depending on how long the episode was, like basically every week. And so he had to obviously really nail down how to plan out how that works, because if you're just going to sit down and just wait for your muse to show up and give you an idea, you're going to be in trouble. So what he would do is essentially, let me see if I can break this down. Like I said, so you have your bare concept, right? Have a boy meets girl, they eventually get married. That's the bare bones. What he would say is, okay, now you need to start basically creating the connective tissue. Like, what scenes need to exist between this beginning point and this end point to work? And the more structure that you understand about storytelling, the easier that'll end up being, right? Because for example, you have like rising action, Act 1, you have like, climax, and like finally in like Act 3 you have to have your falling action resolution on everything. So you go, okay, so for the climax you need something that's kind of big and dramatic, and presumably something that really leaves people going, holy cow, I can't believe this happened. And at the midpoint, some sort of sense, like I would say, this is from script writing, the emotion that you want usually at the midpoint is the opposite of the emotion that you want at the end. That way the end feels so much more, like the contrast makes it like pop, right? So you want a happy ending, the midpoint, generally speaking, should be pretty low, and then obviously you have like the low point that comes a little bit after that. Right, and then it's super low, and then of course when you get to the ending, it's so much better. Or let's say if you have a tragedy, you kind of want it to do the opposite. Not like in an obvious way. You want to be a little bit subtle. Like you wouldn't want to have a tragedy like halfway through, everyone suddenly has a party and it's all wonderful. But in the sense that things maybe, let's say, seem to be going well. So you're going, okay, so in my midpoint, let's say with the boy and the girl, I need some sort of problem that throws a wrinkle into this. Maybe this isn't true love. Like let's say boy's, I don't know, ex-girlfriend appears, right? This is great because you want conflict, this builds a story, and obviously you have this tension suddenly of, oh no, things might not work out because he has, unresolved issues, let's say. So you have to kind of logic this out. So you're going, well, okay, in that case, I need to flesh out, let's say, an ex-girlfriend, because I've decided that that's the thing that makes sense to go in here for the story. So you flesh out the ex-girlfriend, and you basically start working backwards, right? So you have the sky-high picture, and you have to start plugging in essentially pieces that belong where they belong, and then it becomes sort of your job from there to start filling in the details. And the more work you do ahead of time, the easier it is to do that. Marquez, I have a gigantic book. I don't want to go with that one, but I do have a different brick. That one, I did loads of world building and character work. But the reason I did that is because then when you have ideas for scenes, since you've already done all the work on how the world is put together, and you also, at this point, really understand the characters, you basically just put them, almost like they're little dolls, in the situation, the scenario. You already have the little, diagram, the diorama, and they'll just go, right? Because you already sat down with the characters and you're like, okay, so I know that in their childhood they suffered this trauma, and this is their personality, and this is how they generally approach problem solving, and then here's this other character, and this is like their, approach to solve problem solving, and then here's the problem, and here's where they will start basically having conflict with one another. It becomes relatively easy to do that in a very quick manner because you've done all the groundwork. Now, this obviously requires sort of front-loading your work, as it were, and then everything at that point just starts clicking together. It's man, I'm almost forgetting the names of all the like animators at Disney. There were like different animators who did it this way. I forget the name of one of them. Was very famous because he would sit down for like the entire day and get in like every single keyframe basically perfect, and then like the last like 10% of the day it would just come out gorgeous, right? So it's about, I guess, where you're doing the work. I don't know if that makes sense for everybody. I don't want to like keep talking over everyone.
No. I think that was a very, very, very quick but detailed explanation. So let me get closer to the microphone so my audio quality isn't terrible and I don't have to go back and amplify and like it just is a pain. So let me see. I'm gonna do a rundown of my notes just to see that I'm understanding correctly before I throw any questions at you. So what I have is that a planning is, or rather, yeah, planning or having one is to have a set plan, which means it's something that is going to be relatively solid, that you don't actually intend when you plan something to have to change it very often. The point is actually to not to have to change it, because as soon as you start changing things, you end up with the domino problem where things get out of hand.
Yes.
So the idea is there, and to get that, you put out together a skeleton. You can think of that as an outline, which is something like a vague set of characters and their plot, right? So you could think of this as if we're writing, almost like we're writing stock characters, and then we give them like the like a one sentence plot just to start with, so we know who and what is going on. So that would be the characters and plot, the bare concepts, the bare bones that then get fleshed out as we go. Um, Now the flesh out process seems to me to be a kind of description of the main beats, which are detailed out in a cyclical form in order to fit the let's say needs of the plot and the needs of the mood of that particular X section of the plot. Because what I noticed is that when we're thinking this way, we are, and maybe this comes from the TV writing, but we are thinking in terms of the experience of, in this case, the reader, more so than we are thinking at this, high end, zoomed out outline level, necessarily about, that which would naturally follow, right? So if we're writing a tragedy, you'd say probably something like low, high, low, right? Because it starts, I'm thinking the one I always bring up is Hamlet. Starts out
Hmm.
pretty low, gets intense, he starts taking revenge, it's pretty awesome, and then everyone dies.
Yep.
Spoiler alert if you haven't read Hamlet or seen the play.
Spoiler for like a what if like over 500 year
Yeah.
like year old story.
Yeah. So essentially what we have here, and I have this kind of cycle described, is you start with that the vagueness, the bare bones. You flesh it out with details. Those details are made to fit like the mood of what needs to be happening at that moment, right? So at the beginning of the story, you need to, let's say, maybe make the reader feel sympathetic to some shape, form, degree with the protagonist. You need it so because you want them to care. So you think of, okay, like how do I evoke that feeling of sympathy? Then how do I build some type of surprise, right? That's the we call the inciting incident. Something goes awry, goes wrong. That surprise needs to have anticipation. Then we would think of like the rising action. So that essentially those. But the reason why I'm going through plot like that is to try to say, like, when you're planning, that's how you're thinking about it, and then the details that you write in to your plan fit those needs as opposed to some other way, because there's obviously other ways, but that's the way that we're talking about. And then you detail cycle that out essentially till you reach the end of the story. And and why am I calling it a cycle? Because you have, as you fill out your outline, you're kind of looping. So you're at one section of the outline, and then you think, okay, I want to flesh this out with a detail. The details to match the mood, and now I've got a fleshed out piece of the skeleton. Move to a new piece of the skeleton. Like go through those chains of concerns again. Move to another piece, and I won't labor on. So have I gotten anything wrong so far about the idea of, let's say, planning your fiction?
No, at least the approach that he used, like I say, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles scriptwriter. The only other way, maybe if I could expand on it, just to give more of an idea of his approach, is he's literally thinking of scenes, right? Where it's so I have it like he has a scene of the Ninja Turtles start out, and I don't know, the Shredder has a new plan where he's like taking over people's brains through the TV. So it's like, well, you need a scene where they discover that. Then you need to have a scene where they maybe talk to April O'Neil to to come up with a plan. Then you need another scene. And as you say, saying these are scenes that I need in order for the plot to work. You start putting them in order until you have essentially like the whole like outline, right? So that's how you're creating your own stepping stones.
I'm writing down scenes I need in order for the plot to work. I think that's an important sentence.
Right, right.
While I write that down, say for the plot to work. Sorry, I'm a slow writer. This is what I
That's
get for
right.
not being read to as a kid. I'm a meat monkey. All right, so Matt, RJ, do you have any? Do you want to verify your understanding, or did you guys have a different understanding of what Maya just laid down on us?
I I think I do have a fundamental understanding. I guess like if tragedy is low, high, low, like comedy or action would be high, low, higher, maybe. That's
Something like that, yeah.
Mm.
Well, this is all TV or movie stuff, but ideally every scene would have a change in emotion, and that's part of what makes things feel punchy or preventing it from feeling stale. I'm not saying it necessarily works per se for fiction, because fiction is a different medium, but that's sort of how in TV and movies how you construct a
mm,
scene. Well,
mhm,
construct a scene so it doesn't drag, right? Where we just walked into a room, we had a conversation, and we left feeling the exact same way that we did when we entered the room, right? Because then you're kind of like, wow, that
mhm,
was 5 minutes of accomplishing nothing.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question, but does someone else want to talk before I ask it?
I mean,
Matt,
I
it's all on
could
you.
jump in with a corroborating theory, but I don't think it'll quite line up with kind of Amaya's overview.
Well, here, let me ask the question, and then Matt, I'll give you an opportunity because her answer to the question might overlap with what you're thinking about. So, my question is, okay, if this is TV, how much of this did you apply when you were writing, let's say, Dracula's Death or any of your works, really? And where was it the same? Where was it different? Because I think that will give us a more expanded view of potential planning.
Well, I would actually say Dracula's death is a little bit of a bad example on my planning because that was really just me experimenting to see what would this look like if I don't do a TV format. Like, how would this look as a novel? As opposed to, for example, like Dracula's Guest, Dracula's Match, which were more closely just straight adaptations from scripts. Uh, Generally speaking, the expand. Okay, so let's talk about maybe Dracula's Match because that one's a bit of a Frankenstein's monster. Because the original episode that it was based off of was kind of a goofy, over the top. For people who haven't read the book, I'm sorry, I should probably, for your readers, give at least a little bit of an idea.
Pause the video
We have
now. Go purchase Dracula's Match and Dracula's Guest and then Dracula's Death and then read them all. Then make sure you save the timestamp. Then come back and learn. Okay. So
Yeah. I've been told the books are fast reads, so you have no excuse.
Mhm.
um, Basic premise of the series, we have Vlad the Impaler. He is technically a vampire, right? Living in modern day Seattle, he runs into a barista named Cammy, and they encounter various supernatural threats while also dealing with the US government, which is its own threat, right? And then there's a third party that has not yet raised its head. We're getting there. Anywho, the original episode was basically what if a WWE fighter came back as a freaking super undead crazy monster, and then they had a great big stupid testosterone filled like dumb WWE fight, and then that's how Dracula wins the day. That was the original episode. I mean, like they had stuff like they were hitting each other with like telephone poles. It was going to be completely different. Um, Now that wasn't enough to fill up a novel, and so I was like, okay, I need to find something else. I poached some from a different episode that was focusing only on Malcolm. He's a werewolf in the story. So I poached from a different episode and had to kind of smash them together. But the problem at this point is we have on the one hand this super crazy over the top hoorah, smashing your freaking, action figures together kind of story. But then with the Malcolm one, we had something a little bit more mm, dour. So to adapt it to a novel, the problem was one, I needed it to be longer. And then two, actually, novels allow for a lot more time to meditate on themes or to expand on, like messaging or anything else that you want to include in there. Whereas a TV show episode, you got 40 minutes, you got to get it done, right? We don't have time. If there's going to be a cool conversation someone has to have, it's got to be like a minute and you got to move on. So, as I was trying to reconstruct this as a novel with these other bits while finding more information to put in there, it became the question of, okay, I don't think the big fun hoorah testosterone fight actually works, let's say, in novel form, because that is entirely a visual spectacle, right? Describing a WWE fight in a book, I would argue, would not be anywhere near as fun as watching it. This is kind of the problem when it comes to like adapting battles, for example. Like you could go blow by blow, or you could do like what Princess Bride did and give like the actual technical names of every single, sword move for fencing, and your audience will either get that or they won't. And that kind of action, I would say, in a novel can get kind of exhausting if it's going to be, like a 5-minute fight in a movie goes by, light speed, but in a novel, you're going to be stuck in this fight for quite a while. So I said, right, we have to scrap all that and I have to find something else to put in here. And as I was realizing that there were these different requirements for novels, that I had the opportunity to do something completely different. So that's when I started saying, okay, the problem now is the climax. Since it's not a big, stupid, fight, I need a new climax. And so I started thinking, what are other ways I can have this climax work? And I don't want to necessarily spoil it, but I came up with a completely different direction for how the climax could go. But then it had very different requirements, story-wise, to make that climax emotionally satisfying, since it isn't a great big testosterone, fest. It's now very meditative, and sort of melancholy, actually. I was kind of surprised when I was like, oh. But because of that, I had to kind of work backwards to say, okay, so I need then scenes that start building up towards this ending. So how do we get there? It's like, well, I need to start expanding on the antagonist, right? I almost hesitate to call him a villain. He does do some bad things, but I don't think I wrote him as like an evil person per se, so much as a person overcome by the vagaries of life. I mean, he does do bad stuff, obviously, but that, like, I don't feel like his core is that he's evil, right? He was just very, very lost. And then that starts, of course, building a theme. And so when you start having building themes of loss or looking for meaning or things like that, you start saying, well, what else can tie into that? And this is, again, me doing work on the sort of back end, the world building. And then I realized that can tie in a little bit with some of the real life situation in Seattle. Seattle is sort of losing its personality because it was originally kind of a goofy, weird, not quite Portland, not quite that crazy, but close to that crazy, right? And it's just become very corporate. You have a lot of Amazon, giant offices, a lot of freaking glass boxes, and you have Microsoft just taking over. And so now you have this very stark contrast from sort of the original 1800s architecture, some of the quirky little, handful of remaining, local businesses, and then just sort of corporate conglomerate sludge. So there was a little bit of that in there, and to tie that in as far as perhaps the meaning crisis. So when it came to the planning parts, I knew that I had to have at least some action in there. So I was trying to figure out where to put these various scenes. Obviously, for those who have read it, Dracula, the Vlad the Impaler, does not succeed at first in his fights against the antagonist. And in fact, it does look like he would never succeed in an actual direct fight against the antagonist, which I would certainly hope would build a lot of concern and tension for the end, when it is revealed how he overcomes the antagonist. I'm trying to be a little careful here because I'm not trying to spoil it. Dang it. But yes, how he overcomes is perhaps the proper way to put that. And then I also, for example, as far as the planning, I have to find ways for Cammy, the sort of the POV character, to be relevant, because I've been kind of explicit, I think. I don't want her to just be a sword girl, partly because that trope has now been done to absolutely death. I think everyone on the planet now has seen, girl boss, sword, princess, whatever. And it's to the point where now subverting it is the new cool subversion. But to find a way for a totally normal person, an ordinary 20-something with, all of the might of the American education system behind her, with what little that amounts to, being relevant and being able to help in ways that are unique. And that requires, obviously, thinking out what are things that she is capable of doing that, for example, nobody else is capable of doing. And then you have to sit down, and come up with, here are the various things, and then where can these things plug in, right, properly into the story, such that she's not stepping on other people's toes and she doesn't just get completely lost in the background. Which is actually one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Otherwise, I
Yeah.
guess she'd end up being like Krillin and DBZ, right?
Yeah. Poor Krillin.
Or Krillin, man,
And
yeah.
what was his last relevance? Throwing that destructive disc at Frieza and cutting Frieza's tail off. Is that like the last thing he does? That's
I don't
ever.
know. Yeah,
Because by the time
we
the
just lost.
androids, I guess he distracts Android 18 at some point or something. For like
Woo,
three
he was
seconds.
relevant, guys. He
Yeah.
did a thing.
All right. that was quite a number of more details. Thank you, Maya. Matt, you had a lack of overlap as we expanded from TV into novels. Did that persist, or if it did, please describe it.
I would say so. So my theory is that pantsing is plotting, and there's a number of different ways it's described as such. But we have like plot gardening. That's a pretty popular one. But ultimately, there are a number of concrete lines that are drawn throughout a story that allow one to, for lack of a better term, write from A to B, which is from the start of the novel to the end of the novel. Um, there are always needs to move scenes around and change how characters they develop or emerge or show themselves. Um, but ultimately, the ability to write from start to finish by the seat of your pants is the same as writing an outline. Um, Small details might change, but small details always change in a novel. I mean, I don't think there's anyone who's ever just written one draft and shipped it, and it was like, the perfect
Perfect.
novel, and it comes, and the angels come down. Oh, the
Well,
perfect
maybe we
novel.
haven't found that. What is it?
That
Author
person
version of
probably
Mozart.
exists, and they're so rich that we have no ability to even know of their existence. But
Wait, was that how
for
James
us,
Joyce wrote? No,
for
because
us
like
mere
he.
mortals, though, um, we I mean, is it James Joyce? Does he do that? Is that just a one and done?
Well, I remember. I can't. Man, it's sorry. I haven't been in college like 1,000 years, so now my brain doesn't remember details. But I could have sworn I had come across an essay that was written by a contemporary friend of James Joyce, who had come to his house on a Thursday. I don't know. I remember Thursday, but not the name of the friend. Whatever. And James Joyce is in just a fit. And he's like, what's the problem? And Joyce is like, I've only, I've written 7 words this week. And the guy's like, wow, that's really good for you. And James is like, no, there's this one word. It's not perfect, but he wouldn't put it down yet until he found the perfect word ahead of time. So,
Oh, that's what
yeah,
I do all the time.
yeah. So maybe that, I don't know. I'm just saying maybe James Joyce, because only once he put, like, he's like Mozart, right? Like once it's on the page, it's perfect, but he already maybe did all the work in his own brain. So it's still not quite right.
Yeah,
Well,
I want to.
there's
Well, go ahead, Matt.
yeah. Just to kind of add on to that, because that is a good point. There, if we go back to the old pulps, there's Walter B. Gibson, but his process was kind of fairly similar in form to pantsing, I would say. So his overall process was that he needed to pitch a book synopsis. So he would write, what, 1 or 2 paragraphs and mail it, and they'd give him the thumbs up or the thumbs down, and then he'd just write the novel. Um, the thing about like The Shadow, which is what he wrote under the pen name Maxwell Grant, is that it was fairly formulaic. So it was probably closer to TV than the novels that we know today, where I would say a lot of them are quite diverse. But ultimately, he would write one draft, ship it, and that was it. So the question is, you know, where am I going with this? The real question is basically like, if an outline is like a series of things that are happening and there's a shape of a story, why not just fire off the first draft and accept that things are going to change underneath?
Oh, I can think of reasons why, but let me. I can see there's some similarities between some things I was writing down in my notes, Matt, and something you pointed off, and the lack of difference. So, um, let me refer back to my handy dandy note. This is great for the podcast, by the way. I got to start doing this all the time. What I noticed with Dracula's match, right? Let's use that as the example, since that's what we went over. We had an original plan, essentially an original outline, and that outline did not work for a novel. So we took another outline and we then synthesized them, we fused them together, but then that presented its own slew of problems. So then would say, and those problems were predicated again on mood or reader experience. I noticed that. Like, why are we changing the long fight? Well, the long fight will not be experienced in the way it's supposed to be a high point in a TV series, but if you did that in a novel, it's actually kind of there's a way to make it not a slog and actually the fight to make a big fight not actually that long. But that's for another podcast. We can come back and talk about that. But the point is that because it didn't fit the original, let's say, plot points didn't fit, you had to change them, right? So we're still at the outlining phase, but we're starting to do something that that Matt I think is pointing out that a pantser would do. It's just at the outline level as opposed to the drafting level, right? So we're in really terse summary right now, but we're still coming up with, okay, here's what this happens, but then not this, like, okay, we'll do this instead, and you're being creative and inventive, right? In my notes I have, is this not pantsing, so far as we discover, okay, the fight's not the best experience, so then, what do we do? um and I think the similarity there falls into the fact that when you're planning, you in a way are doing something similar to the pantser in that you are being creative, right? Because you're still coming up with the story. Now, in response to your what was question might not be the right word, concern, we'll call it that, Matt, that like, well, or not concern, just, why is it that you couldn't just write the first draft? Here's one answer why. Okay, so when you are thinking, you mentioned, like, it's like Mozart just has it in his head and has to get perfect only once it's on the page. There's a thing about that I learned about from studying Jung, and it's that your thoughts are not the same thing as what's on the page. When you're dreaming, it almost always seems to make sense. It's very rarely that you realize things are happening in like in a way that they shouldn't be able to in the dream. It's usually once you wake up, you realize, oh, it didn't make sense that when I walked out of this door, I ended up out
Right.
in the woods somewhere, right? Why am I bringing that up? Well, I think the same thing is true when you're writing. I think that in your head, you experience it like you do a dream. And when there are holes or inconsistencies or flaws, or just anything wrong, you don't see them until you write them down. And if I'm gonna see the virtue of planning is very good for someone who is very, very creative, but is therefore, in a sense, going to be prone to the lateral thinking running into holes, essentially. Because part of the problem of being very creative and having very loose networks of ideas is that, yeah, you can go to places that seem in the moment like, oh yeah, that'll give me the experience I want. That'll definitely work. And then you have the outline down, and then you realize, actually, plot point 6 contradicts plot point 18. Probably not, you're not numbering them, but like the point is, why not write the first draft? Well, the amount of time and energy that you go into outlining is probably 10 times less than you do drafting. And even if it's not 10 times, it's, few and far between that people outline as easily as they draft prose. So I think that would, and because since we've been talking on for a while, is my assessment there correct? Why not just write the first draft? Well, because you need to ensure that your dreams are not simply delusion, that you can actually construct the story in the way that it feels right in your head and that it works in the way that you intend it to.
Uh, yes, I would expand on that though. There is always the risk if you just sort of see what happens, you'll end up accidentally contradicting yourself. I mean, I have tried that, and then you'll write like a chapter and you'll have an idea and this is really cool, and then 3 chapters later you have a different idea. And at some point when you're done, you go, wait a minute. I had that one plot thread and it just occurred to me. I had no idea where that was going, and I don't think I ever finished it. And now I have to find a way to like, get a wrench and sort of force that back in there, or either to, like, to find a new resolution for it, or else I have to just sort of decapitate it and like remove the work anyway. I did all this work and put it on paper for nothing, and now I gotta like, go back in there and like destroy this thing. Another issue I would say is if you're just sort of, and I'm not saying this is bad, I'm just saying this has been my experience. just sort of uncovering. I think Stephen King calls it like being an archaeologist, when you're just sort of, discovering the story by sort of feeling it out. It can really lack focus. Like, it's kind of sometimes extremely unclear where the story is going. And I apologize, Marquez. This book that you're editing is an example of me doing that, which is why it took a while, I think, to get on track. But I feel like Fyodor Dostoevsky, actually, I think there were at least a couple of books where he just sort of like, all right, well, the rent is due and I gotta write a book. And he just, like vomited out this thing. I shouldn't say vomit, but, like, blah, blah, blah. And here's this novel. And it's certainly very entertaining to read, but at some point you start realizing, wait a minute, were we not doing a thing before? Is that not coming back? No, it's not coming back, right? It's never coming back. You were on a plot and he had a new idea now or something like that. I'm not saying Dostoevsky sucks or anything else like that. I'm just saying that this is, I would say, a potential pitfall of just complete pantsing everything from the beginning.
Yeah, I would say so. Now, here's where I'm going to start asking the more worrisome questions because I myself am a pantser. I'm actually very well aware of those risks. Whenever you guys we all hang out in the same Discord servers. For those of you listening who don't know that, total transparency here. We're all buddies. But whenever anyone asks about particular writing methods, I feel obligated to say, hey, if you're going to do this way, here are the things that could go wrong. And they can go
Yep.
seriously wrong, and you can be in a you could have wasted months potentially. However, I want to ask how certain opposite risks are avoided. So if I'm a pantser and I'm listening to, okay, we're setting up the plan, there's some things that you mentioned that were worrisome to me. Like when you said, I have to find what Cammy can do that's relevant. Like there was a part of my soul that sent up like, red flare beacons, and it was saying like, how is it that the ostensible protagonist, though, you know, Dracula's guest focus was a lot of Cammy. Vlad gets a lot more focus, if I remember right, in Dracula's match, and I have yet to read Dracula's death, which I plan to. I'm so busy. I'll get
It's
to it. I
okay.
promise you, internet and Amaya. But that question itself presents to me a bunch of potential dangers. And I guess how do you get around? Well, I'll start out with just one, and you guys can feel free to jump in with your own questions once Amaya answers. How is it that you avoid the problem of plotting everything out and then suddenly finding that you're, let's say, you have to shoehorn in characters that you really shouldn't have to shoehorn something into? And let me just qualify that in saying, like, with Cammy, if you suddenly took Cammy out of the story, even if everything else worked perfectly, people would notice, and it would you kind of couldn't just, I mean, you could quote unquote get away with it, but I bet you'd lose a bunch of readers. Like say people who like book one, and then all of a sudden Cammy's just not relevant. Like if you didn't have her in there doing something that mattered, then they're gonna be like, what, like, what is this? You're just like suddenly just ditching this character. Like I like that character. What are you doing? And so how do you avoid accidentally putting yourself in a position where you have to shoehorn things in that feel contrived and unnatural when you're planning like this?
Uh, well, generally speaking, the avoiding that comes down to more careful planning. I will say, Cammy is probably my most unusual protagonist I've ever written for. Um, she definitely has a lot of agency in the plot, but I'm not used to having a main character, or let's say again a POV character, as well. I'll continue to call her, who is so, I don't want to say disempowered. 'Cause it's not true, but her like, I'll say power level in the sense of like her physical, let's say, ability is, and to a certain extent, I don't want to say her mental ability, but her education level is so much lower than the deuteragonist, right? Um, I mean, he's like not just miles, we're like, hundreds of miles, beyond her. And that makes it kind of difficult, but she serves a different function than most protagonists, which is something I'm always trying to keep in mind. Um, and again, I have to be kind of careful about her agency is really more what I'm trying to focus on, where she makes decisions to, like, for herself or for her own actions, and that number of her decisions end up moving the plot forward, regardless of whether she, for example, can go up and punch a dragon in the face or something like that, right? Because punching a dragon in the face is the easy way, right, of doing that. The much more difficult way is the subtle way, i.e., where she makes maybe a decision and then everyone else sort of gets wrapped up in it. That was, of course, her entire function essentially in Dracula's Guest, because while Dracula has all this power and everything else, he's not a very active character, certainly not when people first encounter him. He's extremely passive and reactive, right? Which is why he's not, quote, the protagonist. He can't be. He's just not generally making decisions that affect the world. He's not bothering to. Uh, but as far as, like, quote, getting her things to do, this is actually kind of a difficulty I have had since sort of adapting it from TV, right, to novel form. Because now I have to be in Cammy's head a lot more. In a television series, she can just run around, be cute, flash a cute smile, pick up a baseball bat occasionally, whack somebody over the back of the head. It's all, fun and games. Whereas in a novel where I'm in her head and I have to start unpacking her decisions for a reader to, understand, not just because she tells you, but, you get to, like, experience that with her, um, affects how I have to write for her. And again, because the novel series, since I get to talk more, right, than I do in a TV show, I get to actually do more expansion. Like the TV show, for example, which probably I was going to pitch to NBC Universal, where status quo is God. No one has character arcs. There were various elements that I was never going to be able to explore. I was really just doing it because I wanted to make money. I was like, please buy this and then pay me $2 million, and then I can, like, do the things I want to do. And then when I have complete control and it's a novel where it's like, oh, okay, I can actually have a story, right? There could be a beginning, middle, and end. I could do my own Breaking Bad. It's actually quite difficult to sell a Breaking Bad, by the way, even, I think, in the today's world. So that's why I said, okay. And so long before I sat down and wrote Dracula's Guest, the first book, I said, all right, what do I want this overarching now story to look like? And so, I mean, long before you guys ever saw this, I already kind of had a semi-outline of, here's going to be the beginning, middle, and end of the entire series. Here's what's generally going to happen to it. Here's how characters now get to change over the course of the series, which they didn't do before. And so, sorry, to get back to your original question of how do I avoid, for example, Cammy becoming completely irrelevant, or, for example, struggling to, quote, make her relevant, because obviously she's not able to punch dragons. It kind of comes down to planning out, how does she fit into this story as it currently exists? And what is her role in that story as it currently exists, while also remembering this is the kind of character she is. That she's not going to be the big, bad, girl boss who's going in there and, suplexing manticores or something crazy like that. Right? That she has some other function in the story, and to continually remember that that's sort of where that's going would be how. Sorry, that was long-winded. I apologize.
No, it's great. Do you guys, RJ or Matt, have anything you want to chip in? Because I've got a million questions. I don't want to just dominate the whole podcast.
I do. So Jim Butcher, I remember the origin story for his novels, and
Mm-hmm.
basically when he first submitted, oh geez, the name just slipped my mind. Um, he first submitted his series,
Dresden
Dresden Files.
Files.
Thank you.
I
Yeah,
know
Yeah,
because
Dresden
Dresden
Files,
Files.
I
great.
know
Yeah.
the story and I hate. Go ahead.
So he first submitted Dresden Files to his publisher as a proposal, I believe, and he submitted, what was it, like 6 or 7 bullet points or something like that, and like, oh, this is going to be a great book. And then he came in and submitted the first book, and they're like, oh, this is the whole series. Um, would you categorize Jim as a pantser or a plotter? Because he basically just, he made some handful of bullet points for an entire series.
Which one of us are you asking? Or just both?
Uh, for the floor.
Okay. Well, actually, I watched a little bit of it. I didn't get to see the whole thing of a podcast that Tim O'Burnham, he's another Minds author, was on, the Pritchard Pub podcast. I think I can give a YouTube link to that. He was pointing out, and I think he's correct, that there is no such thing essentially as a plotter that isn't at least part pantser, and I would probably argue it's the same in the other direction, at least a little bit. Because a 100% plotter, for example, in some way would not be able to be completely creative, because if you're really just, I need to, that would just be Plotto, right? I think I've talked about that in the Discord. I don't think I've talked about it, obviously, in this podcast. I'll maybe break that down. Plotto is a book that basically gives you every single possible plot point you could have with absolutely no detail or personalization available. You can use it as the skeleton to write basically anything as long as you learn how. It's a little bit of a difficult system, but it more or less is like, a plot point would be something like, character A meets character B and they have a conflict, right? I mean, just the most bare bones something. And that would be 100% plotting, or planning, I should say. Where it's like 100% pantsing is just sort of, I sat down today at my computer and it was a blank screen and I just wrote, complete stream of consciousness, whatever, I'm thinking of a horse today, and that was cool. There's a pony princess, and this, either of them in their purest forms, I think, are just not going to function, and you need a little bit of both in either of them. It just depends on like to what degree you lean in one direction and to what degree you lean in the other direction. I don't know if that kind of gets to your point. Sorry.
Do you
It does.
think
Thank you.
also, do you think it requires, well, obviously it requires training. Like if you do enough plotting, maybe you can actually incorporate that into your pantsing methods a little bit more effectively.
Oh yeah, I think practicing anything will help you to become better um, at it. I mean, when I was a kid, right, when I first sat down and wrote the very first draft of a brick that may never get published now, which I'm very sad about, but whatever. I literally sat down and I had no idea what it was going to be necessarily. I had a dream. This was part of what it was based off of, which was the first episode of a TV series that I never got to watch. It's like I woke up and I was like, oh man, I want to watch that show. And so I just sort of wrote it down, and it was just completely whatever I thought of. I was like, I like this one pop song that was popular at the time, so the pop song's just in there. I was like, I want to have talking animals, is cool. I want to have this reference to Magic the Gathering, the freaking card game. I want to have that in there for no reason because I think it's cool. And I want magical horses. I want those in there, and I want infinite werewolves. And it's like, so I wrote it. Obviously, I just sat down over the course of a summer break, and just spat this out, and it was like 74 pages at the time, and it was a complete mess. I mean, obviously, because it was just whatever I was thinking at the time. And I've spent, the better part of like almost 30 years editing it into something that makes sense. So, uh, uh,
I want to
that's
jump
why.
in there if I can,
Yeah, go ahead.
because in relation to Matt's question and what you just pointed out. So, very briefly, Maya, would you say that you were pantsing that one, the
Oh
75
yeah,
page? Okay,
100%. There was like no plan.
I would say it sounded to me like poor planning. Here's why. And this goes in obviously it is probably great, but as a pantser, that's not the experience of pantsing. You don't write what you want.
Ah,
You don't do that. That's what a plan is. A plan is a preset of things that then the story must adhere to. I like if you have a feeling I really like Magic the Gathering, so there's going to be Magic the Gathering references in here. Um, that's not out of the seat of your pants. That's out of a prescription that then is imposed upon the story. Um, and in terms of Jim Butcher, it's the same issue. I'm familiar with the interview, and essentially, I think he was in graduate school. I think early on in graduate school, he was talking to one of his professors, and she said that he sucked, and he probably did because everyone in grad school, when you first start, you kind of suck, almost all of us, and uh, and so she told him that, and then he went back out of spite and wrote down the most formulaic set of outlines that he could, and then presented that. And then she's like, "Yeah, I think that'll sell. Why don't you do it?" And then we get the story that comes after that, which um, I have personal. I've read the first two Dresden Files novels. I should read the third one because I said to someone I would. One day when I have more time, which you can help me by visiting wildilelit.com and hiring me for anything that I offer, or buying my books. But what I will say there is what I don't like about the Dresden Files is it feels like what you just described to me, Amaya, in a sense. Now, it's more coherent because Jim Butcher was more trained at that point. I assume, I don't know the full background of his education, but if he was in grad school, doing something with writing. He probably did something with English and literature
Well, I
before
know he
that.
doesn't speak French. No, I know he
I,
doesn't because he intentionally had a character mispronounce a French word based on its spelling, but this character should know better, and I don't think he knows Irish Gaelic either. Sorry, those are
probably,
from his books.
yeah, probably not. He does not know. I also don't know those things. I have to look them up at the time where they seem relevant, and I probably get them wrong. So I apologize to the internet when I
Oh
do
yeah,
that.
everyone gets
Uh,
something wrong. It's not. I'm not
yeah,
throwing shade at him like he's the only human it's ever happened to.
but we will throw shade at him, and we will throw shade at him because the parts of the novel that don't work are the fact that they are part of the outline. So there are things that happen that don't make any sense because of the plan. Like the big one was the second novel with the werewolves. Spoiler alert. There's a bunch of scenes, but one that in particular, maybe this is just his lack of knowledge with firearms, but he has Murphy standing in a hallway with the loop guru, is in close proximity in a straight shot to her, and this thing has been established to be lightning fast and lightning strong. And she lets off multiple shots on this thing that are like well aimed after blowing her hair out of her face and giving like a one liner. And I think the thing is she has to blow her hair out of her face. She has to give the one liner, and then she has to shoot accurately and not panically because she fits a particular character type that's plotted out before her. Right before Murphy, the cop, existed, her character existed in the outline. And so then, therefore, now she's in this world and is an arbitrary, uh, let's say, device. And this is
No, I
something
see what
that,
you're getting at.
yeah, she's a literary device now. She's not,
Hmm.
she has no verisimilitude to a real person and is just chunked in there. And like, I read it and like, come on, man, this is lame. This is really, really lame. My professor, Jason Ockert, you can go get one of his books, Wasp Box, which is interesting. I'm not a big fan of the very, 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 very end, like the way that it wraps up, but up to that point, it's pretty cool. And he's a good writer, particularly prose wise. And he said you don't want someone to be able to see the seams. If they can see the seams, which means they can see where you stitch things together, then there's something contrived and unnatural about it. And a question that arises out of all of this is how do you avoid making plot points, making characters, making parts of your setting into um, this is going to sound weird, but how do you avoid making them into literary devices as opposed to um, naturally occurring elements within the story? And I'm going to guess it has to do with more careful planning is how you avoid this.
To a certain extent, yes. The way I would actually say this, because part of the planning is actually it should be getting to know your characters, right, and how they will react. And I would also say, assuming Jim Butcher, let's say, came up with the scene such that I need a one-liner and I need, Murph to do it, whatever. That's actually, for me, I would say the wrong way to go about it. To get back to, for example, a scriptwriter for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, instead, it would be something like a scene like in which bad guys are defeated in a certain way. And then you have to sit down and go, okay, what characters do I have and which character is the one that this fits for, right? You don't just say, I need Donatello to, lose his mind and become like this rage monster because the plot demands someone to lose their mind and become a rage monster in this instance. You go, no, which of the characters would be the one that this would happen with, right? So this is kind of like, I guess, levels of, like Holon theory, sorry, but like depending on which Holon you're on, the plotting is and the planning is very good for again the skeleton of what happens, right? But you don't want it to completely determine sort of the human aspect of it, right? The characters per se, right? Unless like you need your protagonist to walk into a room and be surprised, right? Okay, that's the plot or the plan. But you don't want to just say, well, I need the character to walk into the room and be surprised at a thing that the character would never be surprised for because my entire plot decided that's what it's going to work, right? Then you've completely lost, as you say, verisimilitude. So you always have to bear in mind, I would say, who these people are as you've constructed them and what makes sense to them. And if there is a plot point that you need to have happen and you don't have a character for it, then it's and this is something I've done, then you need to go and fix the plot point. like, because the plot point is clearly incorrect. So I'm still, like, I haven't written anything yet necessarily, but like I'm still going, okay, well there was a mistake here in the skeleton, right? The leg bone didn't actually, this is not actually the foot bone. This is something else. So I need to, pop that back out and put it back in some other way, such that I can maintain the verisimilitude.
Yeah, before someone else jumps in, I have to throw this joke in here. So what we're saying is, Kathy, I guess I'm Kathy Newman in this case. So what we're saying is that we're not Hegelians. The ideal is not more fundamental. The concrete is. And when the concrete contradicts the ideal, when your theory is contradicted by, well, in this case, the simulated reality of the story,
Mhm.
the theory is wrong. So the outline is wrong when push comes to shove. It demands things that are not unavailable to the, to say, details as they have uh, constructed themselves.
Something like that.
Okay. And then you guys can jump in. I just wanted to throw that out there.
So what you're saying is, no, I'm just kidding.
What you're saying is it's all lobsters all the way down.
It's
Sorry.
always lobsters
Kittens
every
and
time.
unicorns.
Um, basically, here's I'm going to throw a little bit of a defense for pantsing in that scenario. So I guess we'll go back to Donatello losing his mind, or we don't want to do that because that wouldn't be his character. He's usually the calm, rational one. Um, essentially, there are those moments when you have to Doc Brown, right? You have the lightning rod at the top of the clock tower, and you got the tree falling down at the bottom, and you got to like connect the two wires together. And how do you do that? It's all mishmashed. There is, especially when there's a highly creative writer, the opportunity to take what these two pieces are, and they're not connecting, and build something out of both sides. So, I I'll just make something up and it's going to be kind of weird, but okay, let's just say like somebody has to lose their mind. There's a plot where you have very calm, rational samurai slash ninja turtles. Um, where do you go when you have to do that? Okay, what are the small details within each scene that might connect them together? The benefit to pantsing in this scenario is that you have already a larger breadth of, say, I don't know, smaller, fine details that wouldn't have been in an outline because that's not really the point of an outline, right? That you might be able to say not use the things that are in front of you, but divine a new answer that would you're still gonna have to do some work to fix it, right? But in the end, the main structural components of the novel haven't changed. And I'm going back to evoking both the what you spoke about, Amaya, the shape of the story, both you and Vonnegut. I would say by the time you've decided the plot, and by the time the plot has begun to develop, it's concreted. It doesn't matter if it's outlined or if it is, just written as is. The shape of the story, you're writing Cinderella, right? You have that really really low, really really low, and it goes up high. If you've ever seen the quick lecture of Vonnegut doing the shape of stories, if not, I highly recommend it.
I haven't, so I'll
Um,
have to look it up.
it's fantastic. He's a fantastic speaker, but I would argue even just starting, right? I'm going to write a novel about a revenge story. You don't have to know the characters. You don't have to know, who, what, where, why, when. You just know there's a revenge story. That's a shape. That's already supposed to exist. And a lot of the say spontaneous errors in some novels where you're reading it and you go, why did this even happen? The shape of the story for this specific story has darted off the charted course. Humans by design are a fan of matchmaking, and the to counter that, because I could already see like, okay, if it's overly formulaic, that's also a problem. But I would argue being overly formulaic is far less severe than suddenly having a happy unicorn scene during a terribly tragic moment of a revenge novel, right? Like this guy might have lost his wife from the hands of a terrible villain, and then smash cut to unicorns and rainbows and fairies, and that's like completely off course. That's not what we expected. And I guess really, I don't know how to tie this all together, but really, I'll just say like that Doc Browning moment is really where Pantsing shines. I'll throw that out there to have it torn apart.
Well, I don't intend to tear it apart. I let me see if I understand because I think I agree with you in some sense. Like, so when you were put in that challenged moment where you're in the process of writing already and you have to, let's say, close a gap, it forces you to be more creative on the spot. And because you were just creating a bunch of other things, you can have, let's say, those things inform what you end up making, and so you will come up with ideas that you wouldn't have if you didn't start writing. So I experience this, like, if if I do start outlining and I'm trying to like I outline so far and I don't know the solution to the problem, the way I find it is I start writing, and then I find the solution to the problem when I get there. Now I will say, you mentioned that the story, as soon as it's in outline form, is concrete. That's not true. Here's why. You know how many, like, if I write like a 20 bullet point outline, I don't get 5 bullet points in before I've deviated severely from that outline and I'm going in a different direction. Because in a scene something will naturally occur, and that's kind of getting into pantsing, but something will occur that flows way better than my, this is to your point, Matt, that flows way better than my imagination could have come up with when I wasn't in the scene. So that's the argument that you're making, like, okay, well, in scene, running off the seat of your pants, you are going to come up with things that you won't from a top down level. Um, but I wouldn't say that. Therefore, we should say that all the outline and the pantsing is as concrete as each other. I do think there is a bit of theory in play, because otherwise it's like a map, right? Like, the map is not the same as the terrain, and if it was, it would be useless because it would just be the terrain. So, and we use maps and they're useful, and so even I outline sometimes to help myself, guide myself along the way. So very clearly there's utility there, but there's still emergence. So I want to throw this question to you, Maya. I noticed that the theme, and now you used the word theme in a sense that I use it in, but you also used it kind of interchangeably with the word I use, motif. So I'm going
Mm.
to define those for the sake of this conversation. Like, a motif is a recurring symbol. A theme is like not like, the theme is the thesis, the
Yes.
argument of the work. Like, I could think of this as the moral, if you will.
Hmm.
And I don't think I do like to frame it that way because it makes it clear when you're planning. What I notice is, because at least with the TV planning, and it seemed to work the same way with the novel, the theme was something that was gathered in the detail gathering phase, and it was not something that came from like the bare bones phase. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, the because it's a sky high, right, view of the story. It's not the down on the ground, right? You can only dictate from up high so much. And it wasn't until I think the when I figured out the climax that I went, okay, yes, this is the theme. At which point, what I have to do then is to go back basically to the outline and start planning with that theme in mind and sort of putting the pieces back in where they should be, with that in mind. Yeah, because when you were talking about like the plot, or the planning not being concrete, it isn't, because if you do discover something, because you inevitably will, and Mark, as you just said this, and you always will, and this is actually true even with making movies. Inevitably, someone will say something on the day of filming, and you're like, oh man, that's so much better, right? You go with it because you have to, right? Because you can't necessarily, unless you're Hitchcock, right? You're not going to necessarily be like the guy who had everything working out the way you wanted to. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, the brick that may never come out, that one was broken for ages, and I kept coming with new and new, outlines and plots and things to fix it, until I realized that what I had to do was something completely different, which is I had to break the entire story to wrap around one particular character, because he was the fulcrum on which the story like revolved. And then once I did that, everything fell into place. Now I still had to figure that out, but once I fell into place, I was like, oh, okay. And then, here we go. Now I can outline everything, and here's how. Now I have the beginning, middle, and end. Right now I know where we're going, how we can get there, so on and so forth.
All right. So that the reason why I asked that is because, particularly in these kind of fringe spaces that we hang out in, theme ends up being rather important, but also so does integrity. Like, right? Because we're in kind of alternative spaces, and what are we tired of? Well, we mentioned the formulaicness of things. Well, why do we get annoyed at the formulaicness of things? Not because it's the same or it's boring, though that can be the case also, but also because it is something like propaganda handed down to us. We need to do an analysis on the movie Wish, for instance, and the writing of the
Oh
movie
goodness.
Wish. Yeah, well, the writing of the movie Wish, the theme was decided beforehand. Most
Yeah.
certainly, they wanted
Yeah.
to tell a particular story, and so they essentially, by doing that, they contradicted themselves throughout the characters are in the opposite like roles they should be in. The plot progresses in a kind of reversed fashion. The
Hmm.
setting doesn't make sense in large part. It's like again, we'll have to get into it, but the point being that when you have a theme ahead of time, you run into problems because you end up, let's say, even as a planner, if your theme is done before you start writing, what will happen is you will be forced to make your theory the standard by which the concrete has to conform.
Yep.
You'll do the opposite of what
It,
you just said, right?
yeah. It will always end up being that way. I think, as you say, I think it almost always ends up being propaganda. Um, the only way I think it doesn't is if you have like the Dostoevsky or the Jurassic Park approach, where you are and you have the idea of the theme ahead of time, but you have here are the characters that are going to be like duking it out in real time, right? Like here's the person on that part of the argument, this person on the other part of the argument, this person that's on this other new part of the argument over here, and we sort of let them hash it out, and then you sort of see how that goes. Um, that would be, I think, the only way that you could approach it with theme initially, and I think in that case also but certainly with Jurassic Park, there was not necessarily like one person was like 100% correct morally per se, but that there were like pitfalls to the various approaches the characters had, and let's say certain approaches had more pitfalls than others. And obviously, this is more in the movie than in the movie. They actually applied more of a moral, I think, value to that, whereas opposed to the book. But regardless,
Yeah. Oh, with them, it sounds like to me, and when you guys can jump in, you don't have to just be quiet. But what that sounds like to me is the more that you have a theme in mind, you have to do one or two things. Either one, you have to essentially pants more to steel man the argument, which is to say, okay, I have this a thing, I think it's true. Now I need to like actually battle it out as best I can by steel manning all the opposite positions and then putting my
mm-hmm.
argument up against that in real time and like trying to defeat myself as hard as I can. Or you could do this is kind of harkening back to something Matt was pointing out before, or you can do that same process in the planning phase, which is to say, you have the idea like here's the argument, the thesis that I think is correct, and I need to challenge it at some point during my story. So you're still in the planning, and when you arrive at that detail, putting the flesh onto the bones, that's when you would do the same thing that the pantser would be doing, right? It just you have more structure around when it happens and the effect that it's necessarily going to have on the reader, but you still go through the same process of here now, right now, I'm going to try and figure out if I can break my own argument, break my own theme, right? Unless, of course, you're a propagandist, in which case you won't do that. You'll just
Oh right,
make
yeah.
you'll put it against a straw man instead of a steel man.
Oh yeah, everyone else is stupid except me. My position is so inherently obviously correct, you idiots. It always works so well, doesn't it?
One thing on
Yeah.
theme, if I could jump in,
Yeah, go ahead.
there is like the postmodernist break. Let's just say around the 70s, well, for the sake of discussion, where theme in and of itself was disconnected from kind of the larger scope of the intent, like the purpose of a story, right? I think we've had this discussion in a prior podcast where theme like the purpose of storytelling, things of that nature. But to go back to say, let's just say we talked about Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, the original, not any of the film adaptations. The initial coming together point was one of divinity almost, and I'm curious if the forward theme aspect of it is not because of kind of the storytelling environment we're in, and not because, say, we have a collective, for lack of a better term, appreciation for the interconnectedness. This is kind of very heady and flighty of how I'm trying to describe this, but like ultimately, all things back then came from God, right? So if we put the theme first, all things come from God, and man and woman should be together. Like there's the initial theme of Romeo and Juliet, and then Shakespeare said, "But what if it's a tragedy?" And then from there stemmed that story.
Well, I might argue, though, even with Romeo and Juliet, technically speaking, it's a tragedy for them personally, but I thought there was at least an implication that the two families realized that what they were doing was causing, essentially, death, right? And so there was, not for the two lovebirds, but for the world, let's say, around them, a sort of a semi-happy ending, right? Or at least an implication that they might be able to now move forward. And there's two ways to look at it, like, right, one, on the one hand, you have the sort of moral lesson of these two feuding families caused essentially this tragedy, their feud, right? And then I thought on the other hand there was that kind of like slight maybe open door at the end of maybe things will work out for other people.
Yeah, all are punished, I think is how the guy screams out at the end, which is to say, um, like now you guys realize you're both to blame that this happened. Like, stop it. Stop sacrificing the young people so that you can fight your stupid, bitter war from ages past.
Right, your stupid feud. Yeah. Well, like so I thought like 3 generations back this guy like said something nasty to my grandfather and whatever, right? Something like that.
In other words, I hate to interrupt, because I don't know as much as you guys. I'm still a novice, but like, in essence, when you're basically the theme oftentimes comes in the course of writing or when you've not finished your book, but well, when you've reached a certain point, you know, when you reached a climax, or the theme could be applied and how you can have how things sum up at the in the end. I'm
Do you
sorry.
mean
So
That's,
yeah, or am I? Do you
no,
want to take this one?
no, go ahead. You're the one who has
Uh,
the college education.
yeah, for what that's worth. So yes, that's when the theme occurs, right? So the theme
Mhm.
is the argument made by the way a story resolves. The climax is when you really answer the question. But I would say that it doesn't have to, as we just discovered, depending on what kind of writer you are, it doesn't exactly have to happen in the process of drafting. It could potentially happen, and am I correct if I'm wrong with this, but I think I'm not. Um, it could happen in the planning phase, but if it does happen in the planning phase, it happens in I mentioned before one of the cycles. So um, as you're putting flesh onto the bones, that part, like the theme is not part of the bones. The theme only comes out of bones with flesh being put on them, and so as that, because that's like the creative space. That's where I would say the planning looks the most like prose writing, at least at the level of content. So you
But
can
never
have a
at bare
theme on.
bones.
I'm sorry, say that. Ask that again.
But never in the bare bones part.
No, because then you just start out with it before you know anything about your
Yeah.
story, right? Because that's
Yes.
what the bare bones are. It's raw
Okay.
theory before any flesh is on there. It's dead. Is that right,
Mm.
Amaya? By the way, did I get that
Mm,
correct?
I Well, I think I can think of two counterexamples where it did start actually at the bones level, but it requires you to construct the story very differently, right? Than say like how I would normally do it. So like the two examples I gave were Dostoevsky and Crichton for Jurassic Park. Because Crime and Punishment is the thing I'm thinking about, and I'm sure one of my friends who actually taught this book like a month ago, he's going to come in the comments now and be like, "You had this wrong." But my understanding is Dostoevsky's for Crime and Punishment came up with the thematic question first of, can murder ever be justified? Right, that was the first question he had, and so he came up with Raskolnikov and all these other various characters specifically to sort of answer this question. And he did try to steelman the argument, of course, right? That was one of the things that he didn't just, now obviously he did not believe that was possible, right? That there is a moral justification for murder specifically, right? Which is actually distinct from killing. Murder being like, this person's not trying to harm you or kill you, or you're not in a war or anything like that, right? This is just some person minding their own business somewhere else, right? And he does go through a lot of effort steel manning all these justifications for Raskolnikov to murder this other guy. I mean, like, he's a terrible person. Raskolnikov's sister's going to sell herself into prostitution. This guy's like a terrible, he's like beating this other woman, just everything, right? He's greedy, rich, old miser that nobody loves and no one will miss, and Raskolnikov is, he's doing this to help his family. He's a good person, blah, blah, blah. So as far as I'm aware, that story was actually constructed from the beginning with that in mind, but that does mean to a certain extent that characters, I don't want to say that they're not characters, but that they are constructed specifically for the theme, and that everyone who comes into the story at that point is actually part of the argument, right? So a character does not come onto the scene unless they're already fitting in here somewhere. And this might be where Wish went wrong, or where Propaganda generally goes wrong. Or to go back to Jurassic Park, my understanding with Michael Crichton, right? He had the idea initially of like, is technology good or bad? Which is very broad, question. And he comes up with essentially the four characters, right? Of Hammond, who's different in the book than he is in the movie, Grant, Ian Malcolm, and what's your toes? And also the kids. And they all sort of perform different functions thematically, right? They're different parts of the argument of whether or not technology is great or whether it's bad.
Mm.
And of course, in Michael Crichton's case, his position is somewhere in the middle. Like sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, and it depends.
Mm.
I think the movie made that a little bit more obvious because, of course, they had to condense it. Even Les Mis, I think, does a similar thing, right? Of like, to what degree is a person a good person? But like I say, I think when you approach right from the bare bones with a theme, you actually have to be aware that you have to have real characters though that embody the various different arguments with regards to it. And where I think the propagandists in particular fall apart is they have like, I have a theme where, I don't know, friggin' women are god monsters or something like that, right? Which is what we see these days. But they don't ever come up with a counter argument, right? They don't actually, even from the beginning, create characters who are going to come in here and say, well, hang on a minute, right? Maybe that's not a good idea. Or maybe it could look like this. Or maybe, by the way, here's the downfall of that, right? So like Hammond is the hyper exuberant, technology is always great, kind of guy. And as it turns out, well, yeah, there are dangers, and his problem was really more not being willing or not being able to see where the dangers lie. And Grant is like a total Luddite living with like freaking dinosaur bones and hating children and like the future and everything. And of course, he has to realize it's kind of a dead end too, right? So they're both ends of that spectrum in order to make the argument work.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just the part was like so basically like if you do come up with a theme in the bare bones approach, um then that's where you have to ask the question of like the moral of the story, and then build everything around it, tailor the characters according to that and how they would react to it, and how to they would react to everything that would be circumstantial from that point.
Yeah,
Would that be
I
the
think it is
case?
a yeah. I think it's a very very different sort of approach to the story at that point. If
Hmm.
you do want to make that work and not just be just straight up propaganda and not just have some Mary Sue coming around punching all the straw men around
Hmm.
and actually like getting people to think about it. Perhaps maybe the way to put it is like it requires you to have thought deeply about this yourself, right?
Hmm.
Like you've maybe at some point yourself pondered, well, what would that look like, right? Let's say,
Hmm.
can murder be justified? And let's say you sat
Hmm.
down and went, well, okay, what are the arguments, pros and cons, right? You sat down and you came up with the pros and cons for, and then decided to put that in the story and give as much as you possibly could. Again, with steel manning in the case of Dostoevsky, but at least even just to be fair, right, in a Crichton sense, to present the pros and cons so that an audience member or reader or whoever can still approach us and still think about what you said instead of you just telling them, right, that, well, this is bad because I said so, and everyone who doesn't agree with me is inherently morally, immoral or stupid or ugly or, whatever, right? The Mary Sue approach. Everyone who doesn't love me, they're just mean people, kind of a deal.
So at this point, we've been going on for a while. I think it'd be good to sum up the process again, just for those listening, because the point of this is for it to be a guide, right? So if you happen to be a pantser like myself or Matt or um, uh, RJ, I think is Robert somewhat a pantser as well. You're used to just writing, and you want to give planning a try. That you can, unless there's any other questions or any other particular points, things that you might have thought of, any of you that you want to warn people about when they do their planning, to like pitfalls. Um, yeah, anything at all that you guys want to throw in there. Going once, going twice.
Basically,
All
if you have a story where the hero can do no wrong, then that's when, that straw man kind of thing. That's when you have that's when you lose focus of the actual story.
a question occurred to me, and to throw it out there. I know a few authors who've suffered from like planning paralysis. Before we wrap up, Amaya or anybody, do you want to say anything to that? Like how to avoid getting stuck in the planning phase forever and then never getting started?
Uh, in my case, that I would say that might indicate someone has a bit of a concern that they'll either lose control or that somehow when they finally get it down, it won't be perfect because they have some sort of perfect idea of the outline in their mind. And inevitably, when you start putting anything down, like this is, I guess, the difference between an architect and an engineer, right? The architect wants his castle in the cloud, and at some point, the engineer has to make that happen. And inevitably, on the ground, something will happen. It always does. And I think that really just kind of comes down to a certain amount of willingness to let like the paint go on the canvas, and sometimes could be a little funny oops, but sometimes a little funny oops actually ends up working, or it creates more character or things like that, and then it's fine, and there's nothing wrong with it. You will never have the perfect story. Nobody will, right? None of us are smart enough. Freaking Shakespeare wasn't smart enough. James Joyce isn't smart enough. Nobody ever was. Nobody will be. And so basically, I guess, try to be less harsh on oneself. I think that's actually where maybe perfectionism comes from, right? It's a high expectation from oneself, and it's okay to not be perfect.
I am crazy harsh on myself, and it's not good. It hinders.
Yeah, it can scare you at that point, right?
Yeah.
Because there's so much
Hmm.
pressure all of a sudden. It's not just like I want to be better, and then like you go to the gym and do better. It's like I need to be. If I'm not Adonis by tomorrow, then like my life is over, right?
Hmm.
Or something like that.
I'll go
I could jump in
full.
as well. Oh,
Oh,
go ahead.
Matt, please do. No, no, Matt, your turn. Go.
One thing about at least planning, I do work in other fields that require a little bit more coordination, is kind of the three strikes rule and doing it in reverse, right? You have three attempts to make an outline, and whatever the third is, you then have to execute on. So, you might have some really good ideas on an outline, jot them down, and then you're going to walk away and be like, "Oh, what about this thing?" And then you add it. Okay, there's your second strike. The third strike is you're going to walk away from that second strike and go, "Wait a minute, what about this?" Then you add it. Then it doesn't matter if you think about something else, you have to then execute. Whatever that comes out of that execution, you then tweak because there's always going to be a second draft.
All right, there. I really like that. It's a really good method because it has a strict limiting factor on it. And I think, you know, oftentimes that's the kind of structure that people need. They need something to say, no more, you have to do it now. Like I do a lot of calisthenics now, but when I used to lift, I'd be at the gym, and like before I did a lot of exercise, I would clap my hands together, pick up the weights, or like jump up on a pull-up bar or something, and then do it. And the clapping the hands was like, it's like ready, set, go, boom. And after that, like I had to initiate. And it was a really great way to motivate myself. Having some marker, something that says, this is as far as you go. And I will say this before we round everything up. If you're getting paralyzed by planning, I think probably you mean to be paralyzed by planning. I think maybe there's a part of you that is afraid. And we mentioned before, like essentially that old adage, perfection is the enemy of the good. Um,
Hmm.
Yes.
yeah, we
Things
want
are
to feel
perfect
good.
enough.
Yeah, I would say I would go further, hopping off of Amaya and I's prior conversation. Go listen to that, by the way. It's my most popular podcast I've ever released when at the time of recording. So, theology, theosophy, um, Christ in the Way, I think is the name of it. Go check it out.
Okay.
But I think perfection is Satanism. I think it is false. All ideals are false idols. Took that from Nietzsche. And I think in this case, that's the same thing. There's this delusion that you can attain this perfection so that you don't have to confront the fact that you're not perfect and that you have flaws, and
Hmm.
that when you go to write something it's going to also be flawed. And by
Hmm.
planning forever, you never have to test your ability. You never have to confront the
Hmm.
world. You never have to confront yourself. And so if you're out there listening to this and you're frozen, you probably mean to be frozen. And that's okay.
Hmm.
I'm not like coming at you like a different episode. I'll come at you about it and shame you. But but for this one, if that's happening to you, if you are perhaps not a pantser and a planner listening to this and paralyzed by paralysis, realize that you're protecting yourself from failure by never starting, which is worse than failure. So don't do that. Fail. It's much better to fail. Go write and fail. And then maybe you can have a three strikes rule. If you write and fail utterly three times, then you
Right.
can go back and plan three times. And then after that, you go write three times, whatever you want to do. But yeah, I would say that. All right. So, very, very quickly going through the planning phase for those of you who made it this long, and be very, very brief. And then Amaya, you give me a check. Yes, that's right. Or no, that's not right. Bare bones. Once you have that, that's essentially bare bones plot and character, maybe bare bones setting, maybe. Once you have that, then you need to flesh out the mood of the story, right? The mood of the story, essentially, that's the what you want to happen to the reader as the plot progresses at different points. And then in order to achieve those in a coherent fashion, you start detailing out the characters you have in the plot that you have. During this process, um, the mood might be dictated by a thematic question, not the theme, but the thematic question that the theme answers. In which case, the mood is dictated by that, and then the characters and setting and all that fit in to create a theme as an emergent property of the detailing, which is putting flesh on the bones. Or maybe the theme emerges totally out of the putting the flesh on the bones to resolve the conflict. When you run into intractable conflicts, the concrete, the actual detailing that emerges as you're putting it out, trumps the theory of your planning. So that means if you have a character and you can't find a reasonable thing for this character to do because of the way that you plotted the plot, then you need to change your plot of the plot because you're squandering your characters unless the character is the thing that is the problem. But for the most part, concrete trumps the ideal because the ideal is a false idol. And doing that will allow you to plan properly, where you do that in piece by piece by piece through each plot point in a cycle. And then eventually you have your characters really fleshed out. The setting gets really fleshed out. You know the theme at that point, and you know exactly how the plot is going to progress. And it's just a matter of putting it into prose. Do I have your approval, Maya, on that rather brief breakdown?
Generally speaking, I think I maybe disagree on the like larger points of ideals being false idols, but uh, I didn't get necessarily into like the character creation part. But I would say, generally speaking, yes, that is the point, or the way to do it. Character creation, though, is its whole other thing on the planning side.
Okay, so yes, but hold the Nietzsche.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. The
Nice.
little ramekin of Nietzsche on the side of it.
Yeah. All right, guys. We'll all do our outros really quickly. I have been MarQuese Little, author editor at Wild Isle Literature, wildislelit.com. Check out Want Smoke Broken. It's available in paperback, hardback, ebook, and I have the whole thing free on audio, read by Dagoth on my website. Again, wildislelit.com. Give that a listen. Also, check out The Tears of Winter, one of the 7 novellas that I'm releasing in the Tales from the Labyrinth series, tied with the Wandsworth series. I'm an editor. I do line editing. Apparently, I do a good job because all the people who I worked with are here to talk with me, and they don't hate me and think that I'm a charlatan and robbing them blind. So I also won't rob you blind if you go over to wildoutlet.com. And then I also ghostwrite if you want me to write your story and you don't have the time or you don't want to spend several years learning how to write because it takes forever. All right, let's go reverse order. RJ, where can people find your stuff? And then Amaya, and then we'll do Matt.
Yeah, my name is Robert Aaron, and you can find my eventually I'll be posting on my Substack, and my stories on my Substack, and also let me see so basically my 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 Substack is, yeah, this is things I should know, but my Substack is at Rob Garin or at Rob or RJ Garin 99. You can find me on Substack there, and that's where I'm going to eventually be posting my stories. You can also find me on Twitter or X at Robert J Garin, and also I have a Minds. Just look me up at Scribbles and Bits. Um, I forgot how I spell I spelled that there. I just recently restarted my Minds, and I actually deleted everything because all the stories were absolutely horrific, and I'm actually giving them a couple of them right now. A major makeover. So
All right, go subscribe
that's
to
it.
Scrolls and Bits on Minds for a fresh start. Amaya, where can people find your stuff?
Try my generally Amazon is the easiest one. You can either Google or say look on Amazon for Amaya Tenshi. I do have an author page, or else you can look up Dracula's Guest, Dracula's Match, Dracula's Death. For Dracula's Guest, you may have to put Amaya Tenshi also in there for Amazon because you probably Dracula's Guest because you might get Stoker's unpublished first chapter. I also have links on my website, amayatenshi.com. I do have a Twitter account, Usagi Tenshi 1, but I don't tweet very often. So those would be, I would say, the best places to find my stuff.
All right. Matt, where can people find you?
You can find all of my writing work at machinehearts.com. I'll be doing ARC Reader signups pretty shortly, so feel free to sign up to the email list there and get all the information for the upcoming Sparrow Warrior series. machinehearts.com.
Which is amazing. I had a chance to see it beforehand. You guys want to check it out? Machine Hearts. Go there. I'll link all you guys' links in the description of this video. Our or what would it be? Audio track if you're on SoundCloud. No one's on SoundCloud. What am I saying? All right, guys. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. This has actually been a pretty great conversation. Like, share, subscribe if you happen to be on YouTube. If YouTube does not murder me, it very well may. I have a verboten person on the podcast. Find out who that is another time. All right, guys. I'll
Dun,
see
dun,
you guys
dun.
later.
All
All
right,
right,
take
thank
care.
you very much.